Hello everyone, and welcome to a new video. In today's video, I shall be making an 18th century ensemble entirely out of bed linens, including a bright yellow cotton quilt and a king-size set of striped sheets. This concept was inspired by Birch Living, who have kindly sponsored today's video, but more on them later on. This ensemble is actually sort of a remake of a previous project of mine, which consisted of quilted jumps and a coordinating skirt. I'll be showing you how I approached this project differently a few years later, and even sharing the pattern for it over on Patreon. If you didn't see my previous video on jumps are a supportive waistcoat-shaped garment that was worn in the 18th century. It was typically worn instead of stays atop the chemise as an outer garment. It offers a similar but much softer silhouette than stays, since the support comes from the quilted material used as opposed to large quantities of boning. But the shaping of the pieces and the heft of the material does offer some support and creates the conical silhouette the 18th century is famous for. They use a lot of the same techniques as stays, but are much easier to make and much more comfortable to wear. So if you find the 18th century scary to sew from, this could be a good garment to start with. In this footage, I'm just tracing the outline of my pattern pieces onto a lightweight canvas that will function as the base layer. In addition to the outline, I'm also marking the boning placement. This won't be nearly as heavily boned as stays, but I do want to add some structural integrity and prevent the seams from riding up or buckling. Both those things will create wrinkles, which aren't particularly attractive. The boning will just help keep everything flat. I mostly added boning to the seams, so its placement can be marked by measuring an inch away from the outline along the side edges of each piece. But there's one floating bone on each back panel and two on each front panel, which offers support to the bust and the eyelets. These were marked by folding back the pattern and marking the fabric at the fold, then connecting the top and bottom markings for each bone to create a straight line as a guide for sewing the boning casing. With everything marked, the pieces could be roughly cut out, leaving large margins around the outline. Then I'm taking 3/8 of an inch wide twill tape and sewing that along my pencil markings to form boning channels. You'll need to sew down both sides and one end to create a stopper for the boning. The end sewn shut should be near the waistline, with the top left open to allow the boning to be inserted. When I made my first pair, I hand-sewed all the boning casing in after the garment was constructed, and I specified that I wish I had done this by machine, and people were confused because then the stitches securing the boning casing would have been visible from the exterior and interfered with the quilted pattern. But this is what I actually meant. I wish I sewed the boning casing in by machine to an additional lining layer, which would then function as flat lining for the quilted layer, and thus not be visible. I just did a really poor job of explaining that. After all the casing was sewn, I pressed the panels, then boning was measured, marked, and cut to be a ½ inch shorter than each channel. At this point in time, I'm only filling the floating channels, not the ones that will be along the seams. So there isn't much to cut and fill, just 2 on each front panel and 1 on each back panel. Then I'm sewing across the tops of the now filled channels so the boning can't escape. Now I'm pinning the roughly cut canvas pieces to the wrong side of my quilt, which will be the outer layer of the jumps. I'm trying to be mindful of the direction of the quilting and making sure that it's going in the same direction across all the pieces. On my last attempt, I quilted the material myself, which is still a totally valid thing to do, it's just way more work. After the layers were pinned together, I roughly cut the pieces from the quilt. I will trim them down more precisely in a bit, but for now it's easier not to have to worry about keeping the edges aligned. Now it is back to the sewing machine where I'm stitching the canvas interlining to the quilted material. I'm stitching along or just inside the pencil outline on the lining layer, and I'm using a relatively large stitch length for this since this step is really just machine basting. The quilted fabric is also so thick that you're going to need a relatively long stitch length for the construction of this project. And now I'm going to interrupt this footage to talk a bit about today's sponsor, Birch Living. Birch Living is a premium mattress in a box company that makes mattresses and sleep products that are comfortable and environmentally conscious. The organic, non-toxic mattresses are made right here in America, and they inspired the concept for this video of turning a pile of cotton bedding into a costume. But I'm also pleased to now be the owner of one of their Birch Luxe Natural mattresses, an upgraded version of their already well-loved Birch mattress. It's crafted with responsibly sourced and sustainably produced materials, including organic cashmere, organic New Zealand wool, fair trade cotton, and 100% natural latex. With 8 different layers, the Luxe was specifically created with breathability and support in mind, both of which very much appeal to me. I'm what one might call a sweaty human being, an unpleasantly sweaty sleeper, and it has made me incredibly conscious of materials I surround myself with. On a day-to-day basis, I live and sleep in nothing but cotton. I've never purchased bedding that is made from a fiber other than cotton, so it is sort of bizarre to me that I never considered what my actual mattress is made from and how that might affect my sleep. The mattress is comprised of an organic cotton cover, a plush quilted Euro top, 3 organic comfort layers, a natural latex pressure relief layer, and over 1,000 individually wrapped steel coils to cradle your body and limit motion transfer. And each Birch Luxe mattress comes with 2 of their Eco Rest pillows made from recycled plastic bottles. They're breathable and better for the environment. I try to avoid social interactions as much as possible, so I really appreciate that their mattresses can be easily purchased through their website. They also offer a 100-night sleep trial along with a 25-year warranty. If it makes you nervous to buy something that you haven't tried, you get more than 3 months to make sure that you love it. And if you don't, they'll pick it up for you and you'll get a full refund. The best part about all of this is that Birch delivers your mattress right to your door for free within the US. It comes rolled up in a box and is super easy to set up yourself. As you can see, Minnie was interested in this process. She may have eaten part of the box in addition to helping set it up. I've only had my Birch mattress for about a week, but so far I'm really enjoying having a more natural, organic, and breathable mattress. It's far more supportive than I'm used to, which helps release pressure points. And it's overall just a huge upgrade from the saggy and suspiciously stained one I was used to and very happy to part with. As you can see, the puppies like it too. Posey did not want to get off of it, even when I was attempting to make the bed. She has also chosen to sleep in bed with me every night since getting it, as opposed to the dog bed she previously favored. I'm not sure how many Birch customers are beagles, but clearly more of them should be. I love my Birch Luxe mattress and think you would too. If you're looking for a new bed, check out Birch. You can click the link below or go to birchliving.com/Clayton for $400 off your mattress plus 2 free pillows. Thank you to Birch for sponsoring this video, and let's step away from sleeping and back to sewing. With that done, I'm finally cutting the pieces down to their proper size. I'm cutting along the pencil outline through both the base layer and the quilted layer. Now is also probably a good time to point out that though this garment has 1-inch seam allowances, it only has those at the side seams which end at the waistline, which means the boning casing in the seams ends at the waistline too. The garment hangs loosely below that point and drapes atop the skirt and its understructure. The bottom edges, neckline, and armholes will all be bound with bias binding. But first, the few and far between side seams need to be sewn, which I'm doing here. I'm stitching the pieces together from the waistline upward with the edges even and the right sides facing each other, and I'm sewing along the pencil marking as opposed to paying attention to the seam guide on my machine. Then I'm repeating that for the center back panel and the front panels until all the pieces are sewn together. The seams were all pressed open and pressed super thoroughly to get them as flat as possible despite the fabric being pretty thick. To reduce bulk further, I'm trimming the seam allowance down to about a 1/4 inch using pinking shears. I find it's easier to seam them together with larger allowances and then trim the excess later, but that could just be me. And now I'm adding the remaining bones to the channels next to the seams, and I held off on doing this until after it was seamed together to avoid potentially stitching over the bone in the process. And like I said earlier, the bones in the seams end at the waistline, and the bottom edge of the channels should be stitched shut to prevent them from slipping past that point. Also, I primarily used plastic boning for this project, but I did double up with metal boning at the center front and the center back just to offer more structural integrity at those points. I set that aside briefly so I could cut out the lining, which is cut from the same pattern, but this time in a lightweight cotton, specifically the cotton sheeting I'll be using for the skirt. These pieces were seamed together at the sides with 1-inch allowances as well, and those seams were also pressed open, but I didn't have to faff around with trimming or boning since this is just the lining. Then I just lined the lining layer up with the quilted layer, with the seams and edges even, and the wrong sides facing each other. If done properly, the lining will hide all the markings and raw edges on the interior. I tend to match the seams up first, then pin outward from those points. Jumps lay pretty flat, so they are pretty easy to line, at least in my opinion. I'm basting the lining to the interior by machine, just stitching the layers together a 1/4 inch or less away from the edges. Anything past that will be visible after the binding is sewn on, which I didn't want. Then I pinned and sewed the shoulder seams, which were sewn with a 1-inch allowance as well. I like leaving shoulder seams wide to allow for adjustments, but luckily none were needed. Then I trimmed the seam allowance using pinking shears and whip stitched what remained to the lining. This just helps prevent fraying, though luckily none of these materials are particularly fray prone. Speaking of fraying, there are still raw edges around the entire perimeter that need to be taken care of, and these edges are going to be bound, and to do that you need binding. Specifically bias binding, which is made from 2-inch wide strips cut on the fabric's diagonal grain line. This gives them some stretch and makes them less prone to puckering and easier to maneuver around tight corners, which is necessary for all the tabs at the bottom of this garment. After all my bias strips were cut, I seamed them together and clipped away the excess seam allowance. Then the seams were pressed, and I also pressed one edge inward by about a 1/2 inch. Then starting from the back of the jumps, I'm aligning the raw edge of the bias strip with the raw edges of the neckline. With the right sides facing each other and a 1/3 of an inch seam allowance, I'm stitching the binding on. I'm not using pins for this because I find they actually make it harder. Not pinning allows you to more easily manipulate the bias binding around curves and leads to a smoother result. And I've heard numerous people who specialize in making stays say this too. Though I'm not sure someone who willingly commits themselves to the torture that is making stays on a daily basis is trustworthy, they probably know their stuff when it comes to binding. When I get to the corners of the tabs, I lift the presser foot and pivot, and when I reach the tight curves at the top of the tabs where the seams are, I start to try to pull the fabric so the edge of it is straight at that point, instead of winding the binding around a sharp curve. I don't know how much sense that makes. I feel like binding tabs, even big easy ones like jumps have, is something you just have to figure out as you go. It has a learning curve that can't be explained through watching someone else do it. Anyway, after that is finished, the hardest part is done. Now from the right side, I'm just turning the binding inward over the raw edge until the width looks even from the exterior. Since the seam allowance was 1/3 of an inch, the finished binding should measure 1/3 of an inch from the right side of the garment. I went with that width because it was what I used on my original pair. I think it was actually supposed to be a 1/2 inch wide, but the fabric I used for binding frayed so badly that I had to use smaller seam allowances. That is part of the reason why I cut my strips to be 2 inches wide, actually, even though they only need to be 1 1/3 inches wide for this width of binding. That additional 2/3 of an inch allows for extra to be turned inward in case you slip up at some point. From the interior of the jumps, I'm whip stitching the inner edge of the binding to the lining. If you don't mind visible top stitching, you could do this by machine, but I think it is actually easier to do it by hand, and I like how that end result looks better, though it is a fair bit slower. I think I was actually watching Stardew Valley streams while doing this because I was so sad I had to work instead of playing Stardew Valley. I'm very committed to my virtual farm life, perhaps too committed if there is such a thing. But Pelican Town was falling apart without me, and now I fixed their community center and museum and caught every fish and unlocked a beach resort for them. And I have so many friendships to maintain and animals and crops to tend to. Who would collect the truffles and make the truffle oil and flirt with the town doctor if I'm not there? Actually, there are probably thousands of people who would do that because this game is very addicting. Anyway, I repeated this process for the armholes as well, so they were neatly bound too. The last step for the jumps are the closures, which are just 6 eyelets on either side, positioned 1 inch away from the front edge. I marked these with a water-soluble pen, then punched holes at those points. I used 2 strands of thick DMC embroidery thread and whip-stitched around the edges of each hole until the raw edges were densely covered with thread, creating a pretty little eyelet. And then I repeated that while I was watching Stardew streams until I was finished. So that is one garment down, and now it is time for the skirt. The skirt will be made from the sheet set, and the first step was actually disassembling the bottom sheet to make it usable. I notched the fabric, then tore off the elasticized edges so the material could be laid flat. This was very satisfying, and I feel like everyone has wanted to do this once or twice when folding fitted sheets. I also did find a use for some of the elastic. It was removed from the channel and used for the cuffs of the chemise. But this video isn't about the chemise, it's about the skirt. The skirt pattern was draped atop a structure made from the remainder of the yellow quilt. It was large and pretty simple, so I didn't bother making a paper pattern. I just used the draped material as a pattern and a ruler to straighten the edges somewhat. The hem of the draped pattern was leveled by lifting the skirt at the waist, causing the top edge to have dips and peaks that cause it to hang relatively evenly over the padding beneath it. The skirt will also feature a ruffle made from 2 14-inch wide strips. And the last minute addition was a wavy bit of trim outlined with smaller ruffles. These ruffles were made from 4-inch wide strips. I notched the material every 4 inches, then tore it at those points as opposed to cutting it. It causes the edges to become more frayed and a bit wavy, so it isn't advisable, but it is way faster. Off camera, I sewed my 4-inch strips together to form a longer strip. My 14-inch strips were sewn together as well. With everything cut, it's now back to work on the body of the skirt. This is going to have openings in the side seams that allow me to get it on and off. I'll be finishing those openings with binding, so I'm marking and then trimming away the excess seam allowance at these points. And the points in question are the top 12 inches of seam allowance on both sides of both the front and back pieces. The remainder of the seams are sewn together with French seams, which is done by sewing a seam with the wrong sides of the fabric facing each other. Then the seam allowance is trimmed close to the stitching and pressed so the right sides are facing each other. Then the seam is sewn again, this time encasing the raw edge inside the seam. I've demoed this in the vast majority of my videos and could not be bothered to film it for this project, apparently. I filmed the sewing part, just not the ironing and trimming part. After the finished seam was pressed, I used bias tape and a 1/2-inch allowance to bind the portion left open. The skirt of the jumps will cover the openings, so unlike the binding on the jumps, which was carefully whip stitched to the interior, I just top stitched the inner edge of this binding down by machine. Now for the hem, I decided to toss historical accuracy aside. I'm wearing this over a petticoat that extends to the knee. To support the skirt beyond that point, I decided to hem it with horsehair braid, which is a stiff woven plastic material. This will also help support the ruffle and prevent it from collapsing the skirt inward at that point due to its weight. That is how I justified it, at least. The braid was sewn on with a 1-inch allowance for the right side of the fabric. Then, as I show here, the horsehair braid is laid flat, then turned inward. This hides the raw edge at the hem and turns the hem inward by an additional inch. Since the hem will be hidden by a ruffle, I'm stitching it down again by machine, about 1 inch away from the edge of the hem. Now I'm pushing the fabric under the presser foot as I sew to roughly gather it between the points I marked at the waistline. And I'm using the seam guide on my machine to ensure this is being done a 1/2 inch away from the edge of the material. Now is probably also a good time to mention that there is an ungathered portion at the center of the front panel, so the skirt will have a flatter shape towards the front. It's also more densely gathered at the back to provide more volume to that area, helping better recreate the 18th century silhouette. This is just a starting point. The machine stitches will also serve as a good guide for binding later on. By hand, I'm using running stitches to more precisely gather the top edges down to specific dimensions. That being said, the sides will overlap and have a tie closure, so the waist of my skirt doesn't have to match my measurements perfectly by any means. To create that tie closure and finish off the top edge nicely, I'm using some bright yellow grosgrain ribbon. I cut 2 3-yard lengths of this, then used a pin to mark the center point of both pieces. The center of each length of ribbon was pinned to the center of each skirt panel, a 1/2 inch below the top edge. You don't have to measure a 1/2 inch away, you just have to align it with the stitch line created when roughly gathering it down earlier on. Isn't that handy? I sewed the ribbon on, stitching very close to the edge from one bound edge of the panel to the other. Then the ribbon was wrapped over the raw edge and the other side was stitched down. A little over 1 yard of ribbon extends beyond each edge of each panel, which is plenty to use for the closure. So that finishes off the skirt base. Now it is on to the trims. I'm using a rolled hemming foot to hem the bottom edge of the 14-inch long strip. I have gotten slightly better at using these feet, and I must say the cotton sheeting was a great weight to practice on. To be honest, I don't really like using sheeting for garments since it's so thin, but it's also crisp, meaning it doesn't drape well, but it isn't heavy enough to support structured designs either. It's also incredibly prone to wrinkling, so garments constructed from it typically require a lot of ironing and maintenance. I think it's a great option for mock-ups, foundation garments, or just practicing your sewing and fitting skills. But if you have the option and ability to buy apparel weight cotton fabric, I think you'll end up with a much better and more wearable garment. I know not everyone has access to those things, and I'm not trying to shame anyone for using what they have available to them. I just think it's unfortunate when people put a lot of time and effort into something and it ends up not being as wearable as they want it to be due to the fabric that they picked to make it out of. Anyway, enough on that. After it was hemmed and pressed, I gathered the top edge down using that same sloppy machine method of just pushing it under the presser foot as I sew. Then I turned my attention to the smaller ruffles. These are so narrow that it was faster and easier to fold them in half and use the folded edge as a hem as opposed to trying to actually hem them. So that's what I'm doing here. Then I am using that gathering method, if you can call it that, one last time to gather these strips to about half their original length. These strips will be sewn to the edges of a wavy strip cut from the quilted material, to add some contrast and interest to the skirt. I cut the quilted strips out using a template that was traced onto the material. I had to cut 2 or 3 of these strips, which were then sewn together and pressed. The ruffles were sewn onto this strip by machine with the right sides facing each other and a 1/4 inch allowance, and ruffles were sewn onto both the top and bottom edges of the quilted strip. The ruffles were inclined to stay folded inward, which looked really bad, so I spent a good long while pressing them into submission until they were turned outward and neatly outlined the quilted material. As a side note, I am currently filming this voiceover in a cold room in the middle of the night, and fantasizing about how nice and cozy it would be to hold a warm iron handle right now, which really speaks to my current mental state and temperature. Now it is time to position the ruffles and trims, and I'm doing this by marking a line 12 inches away from the hem of the base of the skirt, once again with a water-soluble pen. Then the top edge of the 14-inch strip turned ruffle is pinned to that point all the way around the skirt. After that was done, the topmost point of the quilted strip will also be aligned with this marking, as you can see me start to do here. I'm pinning the high points of the strip first, then pinning outward from those points. I'm also removing the pins underneath the strip that initially held the wider ruffle on as I go, so they don't get trapped when the quilted strip is stitched down. And speaking of stitched on, the bottom edge of the strip was sewn on first. If I then went through and tried to sew down the top edge, you you would see the raw edge of the wider ruffle sticking out at points. Since the quilted strip is wavy, it doesn't fully cover the entirety of the top edge of the ruffle. So to avoid this, the quilted strip was folded down and I went through and trimmed the top edge of the ruffle to be about 1 inch wide, so it would all be hidden after the remaining edge was stitched down, which is what you can see me doing in this footage. What you don't see in this footage is that the ends of the ribbon at the waist were hanging down and accidentally sewn to the underside at several points, so I had to rip a great deal of this out and redo it. So maybe coil up the waist ties and pin them out of the way before adding trims. That's like the opposite of a pro tip. It is a tip I am giving you based off of my incompetence. Now the project looked like this, and I honestly just didn't love it or hate it. I can appreciate simplicity in classical lines and tailored projects, but not on something like this. It was just very bland, and I definitely don't like bland. I tried to jazz it up by adding some floral trims to the edges of the chemise, and then I mimicked that by adding some artificial flowers to the peaks of the trim on the skirt. I glued these on because the glue melts the plastic backing and really fuses the flowers to the fabric in a way sewing them on doesn't. It wasn't out of laziness, I swear it. This made me like the project better, but I still don't love it. I think a lot of it is because of the color, honestly. If it was pink, I'd probably like it a lot more. And if it was sparkly, well, how can you not like something that's sparkly? I picked the yellow because I love the floral quilting on this quilt, and I envisioned it to be more of a brownish yellow sunflower color, very autumnal. And instead I feel major summer vibes, and I really don't like summer. Even though this project isn't pink or sparkly or my favorite thing in the world, I do like how the pieces and materials look together. I think the floral additions helped liven it up, and I tried to break the yellow up even further with red hair and matching shoes. Though the hem was slightly longer than I intended, so the shoes aren't super visible. But if the hem being a little long is the biggest fault with the project, I will count that as a win. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, both seeing what can be accomplished from a bedding set and my second attempt at jumps, with new and improved construction. This time around, the interior looks much prettier and they went together much faster. They don't fit quite as well as they did 3 years ago, but I suppose that is to be expected. If you would like to attempt your own gems, I will have the pattern I drafted for these over on Patreon. And thanks so much for watching, and to Birch Living for sponsoring this video. Hopefully you will subscribe and stay tuned for more, and I will talk to you all very soon.